I've been reading a really great book about suffering, and I was thinking I would preach on suffering this morning. And then I read the psalm, and it was all about new life and about joy of the Lord. And I wondered, am I just really gloomy because it's been raining so much that I would want to preach on suffering? I hope at the end of 20 minutes here or so we'll have a connection between joy and suffering. One of my favorite authors, Michael O'Brien, said that suffering is the only thing strong enough to carve bowls out of our stone hearts so joy can collect there. I hope we can see some connections between that. Let's go to the psalm here for a minute. The part that I wanted to look at first very much relates to our weather outside. You visit the earth and you water it. You make it abundantly fertile. God's stream is filled with water. At the end there, you shower. You keep it soft, blessing its young sprouts. Drenching, we see, is the word here. I didn't think I would ever appreciate rain because I grew up on the lower Rainland, and it was awful. I thought if I could never see rain again in my life, that would be all right. But now that we've had such a dry summer, and our fields died, and we didn't have enough grass for our horses, and we fed them hay all summer, and then there's a hay shortage, I very much understand the blessing that comes from rain. Now, as we look at the rain that comes down and we think about the suffering that comes, one of the first perspectives that any of us might have when we endure suffering is, well, why me? Why is this coming on me and not on somebody else? And when Jesus instructs us about suffering and about how we're to be like our Father in heaven, like our dad, he says he wants us to be like our dad, to love our neighbors and our enemies. Not to hate our enemies like everybody else does, but to love our neighbors and our enemies. And that we're to be like him who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and to send rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. That this happens to everybody. That the rain comes down on everybody. The suffering in our lives falls on all of us. When I've been reading Ezekiel, there's a word that Ezekiel uses to address, or there's a word that God uses to address Ezekiel. He says, human being. He doesn't even call him by name sometimes. And that stuck out to me because it really illustrates the otherness of God from us. When he says human being, it's very clear to Ezekiel that he's nothing like the one who's addressing him. And all the different illustrations we get, this is one of hundreds on the internet of what that vision is, or of what John sees in the book of Revelation. None of them look quite alike because there's so many details and it's so hard to picture God in his otherness, in his very, very differentness from us. I'm more prone to think sometimes of the Buddy Jesus. Who's seen the Buddy Jesus before? They make little figurines and action figures. They have statues. It's obviously poking fun at an American idea of who Jesus is, which is he's just our buddy to do our bidding. And I can fall into an intimacy and into a love of God where I can also have a feeling that God is not much different from me. When I'm talking to him in prayers, I might complain and I might think, well, God, that's not fair. It's not fair that you would do this. And I'm talking to him almost as an equal. And when I pigeonhole God like that into an image of an equal, rather than have the vision of Ezekiel of a God absolutely, stunningly incomprehensible, I'm at risk of being a judge over God and his actions. I'm at risk of thinking, well, is that really the best idea, God, that you would do that for me right now? Or is that really the best that you could do that for me? As I be a judge over God, that's an inappropriate place. And it's a place, when it comes to suffering, that hurts our perspective. Let's take the perspective of two people who are undergoing suffering. The one person becomes bitter, and the other grows stronger through their suffering, rises above it. Why is that? Why do some people seem to get crushed down and stomped into the ground through their suffering, and others seem to grow stronger? In the great book I've been reading by Philip Yancey, there's a suggestion here that our reaction to suffering has so much to do with whether we're brought low or whether we're brought up in it. He would say that it isn't the amount of suffering, that there are people who face enormous, enormous suffering. But it isn't the amount of suffering that we go through in this world that will determine which of those responses we have. Instead, it's whether we take a response of why or a response of what can I do with this? To what end? If we take the why stance, I'm sad to say that a lot of our hearts just become bitter, and we become lost in a spiral of why. Coming as a judge over God and saying, why would you do this to me, often results in a very bitter place. And it doesn't produce fruit in our lives. It doesn't come to any kind of a conclusion for us. Instead, we find ourselves crushed. If we, instead of the why, say to what end, it's in those places that we can see maybe fruit. And I can see in this conversation between Jesus and his disciples that they also asked this why question of Jesus. They said, they encountered a person born blind, and they said to him, Jesus, why? Who was the sinner? Was it him or his mom or his dad? Who sinned that he should be born blind? Why is he suffering like this? They asked. And Jesus doesn't answer in a why answer. He says, this happened that the work of God might be displayed in him. He answers, to what end? What was the result? The result of this is that Jesus is going to heal him and that he's going to show the marvelous power of God. That was the result. Jesus doesn't address the why, and we don't know the why. We know lots of things, but we don't know the why in this. And Jesus looks at the what end can have, what good thing can come out of this. Let's look back at our psalm here again. By awesome deeds in righteousness you will answer us, O God of our salvation, who established the mountains by his strength. Being clothed with power. Did you catch that? He's answering our prayers, and he's clothed in power. There is nobody more powerful. You who still the noise of the seas. Can you picture Jesus on the boat? And at his word, everything is just still. All this storm. Imagine we're down at Kai Bay, or we're down on the ocean, and there's just the wailing storm. And Jesus just says, be still. And in an instant, it's still. When we hear this, to some, they rejoice. Wow, look at the power of God. And to others, it's like salt on the wound. Why isn't my prayer answered? The psalmist is rejoicing in their answered prayer, but why isn't my answer coming? And if God has so much power that he can stop oceans from roaring, why doesn't he answer me? What has he got against me? Why does he make me suffer? If we fall into this why, all of this beautiful psalm of rejoicing in God's power becomes a bit of a wound, saying, well, it's not happening in my life. It's not happening for me. And I know some people here are going to say to me today, well, easy for you to say. You don't look like you're suffering very much. And you'd be right. I'm young, I'm 36, and I haven't endured great suffering in my life. And many of you have. And if you hear me saying a sermon on suffering, I don't sound like the right person to give that sermon at all, because I haven't suffered enough to say anything meaningful to you. And I hear that. So what I did is I collected a clip of somebody who has gone through some suffering, and I wanted to gain her perspective on it this morning. And let's get the sound up, and we'll play that.
I grew up in a very athletic family, tennis, horseback riding. Just a few weeks after high school graduation, as I was preparing to head off to college, my sister Kathy invited me to go to the beach for a swim. I swam out to this raft. Athlete that I was, I didn't even touch bottom, hoisted myself up onto it, and then took this really stupid dive into what ended up being extremely shallow water. I snapped my head back when I hit bottom, and it crunched my 4th cervical vertebrae, severing my spinal cord. There I was lying face down in the water. desperately hoping that my sister Kathy would please notice that I had not surfaced from my dive. Unbeknownst to me, her back was turned to me. She didn't even see me take that dive. But a crab bit her toe. And it so startled her that she quick turned around in the water and screamed to me, "Johnny, watch out for crabs." And when she did, she saw my blonde hair floating on the surface. I was face down, ready to drown. She came swimming quickly, pulled me up out of the water. And I never was so grateful for fresh air. She saved me. But for what purpose, for what reason? Because now, lying there in a hospital, doctors told me I was going to have to sit down for the rest of my life as a quadriplegic without use of my legs or even my hands. My hands don't work. And I remember thinking, God, is this your idea of an answer to a prayer to be drawn closer to you? If it is, you're never going to be trusted with another one of my prayers again. I mean, I'm a new Christian. How could you have taken me so seriously? I sank into deep depression. I remember there were wonderful Christian friends who came to the hospital and they encouraged me. And one Bible verse they shared was from Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, where God says, "I know the plans I have for you, plans not to harm you, but to help you, plans to prosper you and to give you a hopeful future." God, you mean you plan not to harm me? Well, what do you call quadriplegia, huh? What's that all about? As I read that verse and the context around it, I realized something. That when God said that, he was saying it to his children who were being dragged away into captivity by the Babylonians. They were going to exile. They were going into slavery. They had decades in front of them of hard, awful suffering. And I began to see that God's plans for a hopeful future for me was not necessarily jumping up, dancing, kicking, doing aerobics, running, walking, getting back use of my arms and my legs. No, God's plans for me go far deeper, a deeper healing, a precious healing of the soul. Because as I was pushed into the arms of God every morning, and that's the truth, even to this day, don't be thinking I'm an expert at quadriplegia, but as it was then in the hospital and as it is today, every morning I wake up saying, "Jesus, I can't do this thing called life. Please help me. Please show up. Give me your smile. Give me your strength, because I can't make it through the day." And because I go to God with that earnest dependency and requirement of his grace every single day, I take that back. No, every single moment, I experience the sweetest, most precious, most intimate union with Jesus Christ. So in Jeremiah 29, when God says he won't harm us, doesn't mean the body, doesn't mean our circumstances. He's not going to do anything to harm our soul. Yes, our body may get harmed, but it will somehow serve to enrich our soul. In closing, let me just say that quadriplegia, 46 years of it, that's a long time. I deal with chronic pain. I had breast cancer a couple of years ago, and I remember as my husband was driving me home in the van from chemotherapy one day, we were talking about how suffering is like little splashovers of hell, kind of like waking us up out of our spiritual slumber. And then we pulled in the driveway and he said, "Well, then what do you think splashovers of heaven are? Are they those easy, breezy, bright times where everything's going your way, where you have health?" And we said, no. Splashovers of heaven are finding Jesus in your splashover of hell. And to find Jesus in your hell is ecstasy beyond compare. And I wouldn't trade it for any amount of walking in this world.
In her story, she doesn't get into the details of how humbled she was as a graduate, a beautiful athlete, so strong and full of health, taking chances. How many of us took chances when we were young and dove when we didn't know how deep it was, and turned instead into a strung out held and suspended in air, not able to feel anything in her body, just a floating head, where she couldn't even commit suicide when she wanted to. Her face, from being upside down all day long, sunken in from no food, hollows for eyes. She looked like a skull. Her hair, everything shaved off as they bolted into her skull. I'm not trying to gross you guys out. I'm saying that she was beyond humbled. And in that, she found a place of joy. And in that relationship that she had with God, she was able to grow. And she shared her story with so many people, and she's been used in so many ways because of this accident that happened to her. I know in my own theologizing, I can be a little bit like Job, where I want to point the finger at what's going on and offer solution. I'll have my best theories. I'll take my stab at how, but this is what's needed in a universe of free will for love to exist, that we have to suffer. But that's not what I see at the end of Job. I don't see that any of those answers were the right answer. Instead, God shows up in power and says, you don't understand. You really don't understand. And it doesn't seem that he could understand, or that he could explain it to us, even if we could. It would be like Lexi, when I give her a rule, she says, why? And sometimes, I'm sorry, you just can't understand right now the why, but you still have to listen. What helps me, I know that at the end of Job, there was a whole bunch of illustrations of animals, and sometimes in our modern age, so equipped with education, we kind of turn up our noses at, those were such simplistic things that were offered to Job. We understand all those now. And what helps me to see the grandeur of God, to see how incomprehensible he is when I start looking at the size of the universe, and these charts really don't do justice to it at all. There's no way for us to get our head around how big the universe is, 93 billion light years across of our observed space, and it could go beyond that. We don't even understand a light year. Traveling at the speed of light for a year, we can't comprehend a billion of really anything other than maybe debt for our country, right? And even those dollars seem way out there. When I think of the size of God, and that he was able to create this in a moment, and that he knows what's going on with those uncountable stars, and that he knows what's going on with 7 billion humans, I think this is not my buddy Jesus who is in charge here. This is a God who is so powerful and so much smarter than I am, and who couldn't just say the why answer in a second to why we suffer. When I'm trusting God, I'm not trusting that I'm going to get my way. That's sometimes what we think of when we think of I'll trust, and then I'll get my way out of this. I'm trusting in the goodness of his character. And when I'm talking to students about whether they should follow or not, I like to think that it isn't about what happens up here. Because I had some students early on in my youth ministry, and I had a lot of arguments with them that happened up here. And one of them recently said, I've changed my mind up here. But I know what happened for me in my understanding of trusting God's character happened here from the Holy Spirit. It wasn't a change of philosophy or a change of my opinions of whether God is just or not. It was a change of heart towards how I trusted God. It was a change of the Holy Spirit. So when I'm talking to students, I want to help them to see God's character is good. And that doesn't necessarily mean explaining much about God at all, because there's lots of things that I can't explain. But the beauty of it is that my daughter, who turns 3 today, it's Lexi's 3rd birthday today, make sure you give her a high five or tell her happy birthday, that she can understand the gospel. That is why the gospel is so beautiful, that she can answer about God's love. She can comprehend that, like a father who would run into a thorn bush for her, or run into a campfire to steal her out of danger, or run into where a bear was or a cougar to try and rescue her. A father who would go into danger for her loves her. There's no arguing that that is love. And there's no arguing with the cross. It is so simple for everybody to see. You cannot argue about God's love in the cross, because he has gone into danger to rescue us. He has become like us. In all of his power, he shed that. and he became weak, and he became humble, and he lost all of his beauty, lost all of his power, his ability to just have everything his way. And he was so humbled for us, to rescue us. And then in the end, if you want to point at injustice, you can point at no better example of injustice than how they treated Jesus, a perfect man, an innocent man, going through the torture chamber for us. That is injustice. And out of that, we see the connection of joy. Jesus tells us that, like the woman giving birth, there's labor, there is pain for a moment. But in the end, on the other side of that, when we have suffered, and when we choose not to be the one who says, "Why me, God? Why would you do this to me?" But instead we say, "To what end? What would you like me to do, God? How would you want me to be fruitful? How do you want me to be used in this? This really hurts, and it's really awful. But how do you want to use this so that I can be used?" If we say that, if we, like Jesus did, he was on the cross too, saying, "Why, Father? Can't you make this go away?" But he also was willing. He said, "Your will." He didn't understand necessarily, but he said, "Your will." And he said, "To what end?" And the end result was the fruitfulness of saving us all. That in the gospel, in the simplicity of the gospel, all of us are saved in grace, saved in love, paid for, adopted by God into his arms, and loved because of what Jesus did. And that joy is unmatchable. No amount of anything can compare with that joy that was in Jesus and that can be in us too.